From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Let's talk a little bit about the debate on the Republican side that's breaking out over what happened on Tuesday. And Kyle, a lot of folks, including me, are pointing to Donald Trump as one of the reasons for the defeat. But here's what the president said in his defense, former president. He said, "Look, I got 1 million more votes than Ron DeSantis, so I had a better outcome than DeSantis did." Wow, okay. And he also said that his endorsement record was 216-19 in this midterm, which he said is a great track record. What's your view of those comments?
Well, the Florida comparison is fascinating because, of course, the turnout is different in a presidential year than it is in a midterm year.
You used a very gentle word there, fascinating.
Sure.
That's not quite the word I would have chosen.
If you want to go by margins, Ron DeSantis won re-election by 20 points, which is nowhere near what President Trump did in 2020 or in 2016. On the point about the endorsements, the ones you have to look at are the ones where he made a difference. You know, when he makes hundreds of endorsements of red Republican candidates in pretty red districts, maybe he likes those candidates, but he's also doing that to pad his record. And the ones where it really matters are the ones where Trump's coming in is what put that candidate potentially over the top in the primary. And on that point, he's a little bit on the defense. He's saying that...
A little bit on the defense? Give me a break, Kyle. He's got J.D. Vance. Who else does he have? Who else did he endorse who then came across the finish line? J.D. Vance. I guess Kerry Lake in Arizona still has a shot. But Tim Michels lost. He did worse than Scott Walker did against Tony Evers in Wisconsin. Mastriano in Pennsylvania. I mean, he barely had a campaign for governor, and the whole thing got washed out. Pennsylvania's a catastrophe for the Republicans. And then you have Mehmet Oz, who he endorsed over David McCormick. He lost by 3 points to the most left-wing candidate this side of Elizabeth Warren in Pennsylvania. And then you've got Blake Masters losing in Arizona. I mean, it seems to me that Donald Trump's fingerprints are all over this defeat.
I agree. And what I mean when I say he's on the defense is just reading his Truth Social feed and the woeful attempts to get out of these endorsements. So he said that Don Bolduc in New Hampshire disavowed election fraud after he won the Republican primary. And if he stayed strong and true, he would have won easily. I am skeptical that the problem in New Hampshire was that the people of New Hampshire in the general election wanted more talk about the 2020 election fraud. Just this morning, Trump is trying to wiggle out of the Dr. Oz endorsement. He said, "Oz is a wonderful guy who really worked hard and was a very good candidate, but he was long in the race before I ever endorsed him." And then Trump added he was also not a denier, his mistake. And this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, of where he made the difference, because that Republican primary in Pennsylvania between Mehmet Oz and David McCormick was so close that it went for weeks without knowing a winner. And it is really easy to imagine if Trump had even just stayed out of the race, that David McCormick would have won that and maybe probably won the Senate seat.
Well, he was decisive in the McCormick versus Oz race. He's rewriting history, and he knows it, doing so because he realizes what's happening here, Kim. I don't know if you may not agree with me, but I mean, I think that what's happening here is Republicans are looking at these results and saying, maybe the focus on the 2020 election campaign is wrong. And that was the litmus test for Donald Trump's endorsement. And I know that from talking to candidates they talked to personally and said, you will not get my endorsement unless you say that the election in 2020 was stolen. And some didn't do that, and they didn't get the endorsement. And then Trump himself, after his presidency, has become toxic in some of these states. And I think his presence and injecting himself into this election, not just through the appointment of candidates or the endorsements of certain candidates, but also through the general participation in the last 2 or 3 weeks, where he injected himself constantly through rallies and comments and gave the media attempt to play it up, I think it helped drive Democratic turnout.
Yeah, if Republicans aren't thinking this, they should be. Everything you say is correct. He owned all of these candidates. By the way, let me just say, too, we wrote an editorial on this. I put it on social media. The people who do not agree with this is their pushback. They say, well, Trump wasn't on the ballot. Well, actually, he was in terms of the candidates that he was decisive in choosing, who he put over the finish line. In fact, by the way, he owned that and bragged about it right up until they all lost. So, yes, he does actually own these guys, and they were on the ballot. And then the other complaint I had is, well, Mitch McConnell and the establishment didn't do enough to help these guys because they're anti-Trump. They spent a fortune trying to drag these guys over the line, okay? And the one place where it ended up being successful was in Ohio in J.D. Vance. And by the way, they gave money to J.D. Vance, even though Vance had said he wouldn't vote for McConnell for leader. They still went in and gave him tens of millions of dollars. By the way, I would also point out that race probably only went the way it did because Mike DeWine, who is the anti-Trump, was so amazingly reelected in that state and pulled out so many voters, and that probably helped Vance as well, too. But you can't argue that there wasn't every resource expended to try to get Blake Masters done, to get Mehmet Oz over the line, to help Tudor Dixon and Tim Michaels, and they still wouldn't, all the money in the world wouldn't help. So to suggest that Donald Trump doesn't bear an enormous amount of blame here is simply wrong. And that is not a commentary on your loyalty or anything. That's just simply reality. And I think Republicans are going to need to ask themselves, especially in light of the fact that they have such a strong bench of younger leaders, if it isn't time to look to them. Given recent history in these elections, there's been a lot of losses and Donald Trump's fingers are in most of that.
All right, let's turn to the other side of the aisle. And Joe Biden on the Democrats, and Joe Biden strolled out at 4 p.m. on Wednesday to take a little victory lap. Let's listen to a couple of clips from that.
So I'm not going to change the direction. I said I ran for 3 reasons. I'm going to continue to stay where I am, and I know I fully understand the legitimate concern that what I'm saying is wrong, okay? One is that I said we're going to restore the soul of the country, begin to treat each other with decency, honor, and integrity. And it's starting to happen. People are the conversations are becoming more normal, becoming more. How can I say it? Decent. Second thing I said was I want to build a country from the middle out, the bottom up, and that way everybody does fine. I'm tired of trickle down. Not a whole lot trickles down when you trickle down to hardworking folks. And the third thing I know is still very hard. I'm going to do everything in my power to see to unite the country. It's hard to sustain yourself as a leading democracy in the world if you can't generate some unity. So I'm not going to change anything in any fundamental way. Our intention is to run again. That's been our intention, regardless of what the outcome of this election was. The fact that we won, I didn't run, the fact that the Democratic Party outperformed anything anyone expected and did better than any off-year presidency since John Kennedy is one that gives everybody like, whew, sigh of relief that the mega Republicans are not taking over the government again, et cetera. And so my judgment of running when I announce, my intention is that I run again, but I'm a great respecter of fate, and this is ultimately a family decision. I think everybody wants me to run, but we're going to have discussions about it.
Kyle, let's take the not changing a thing first because he thinks that's uniting the country. I guess we're going to get more of the first 2 years here, no matter who runs Congress.
It seems so, and I think President Biden is at risk of misreading these results. I think he should read this and be thanking President Trump for screwing it up the Republican prospects so royally here. But it's easy to imagine with different Republican candidates on the Senate ballot, a Republican Senate of 53 or maybe 54 seats. And so I think maybe as President Biden goes toward 2024, he maybe would have been better off with a stronger Republican victory, maybe not a huge wave, but a little wave that would force him towards the center. That's what he told the public he was going to do in 2020. I think he hasn't done that. After he won the Democratic nomination, he brought Bernie Sanders in and they found common ground on an agenda. And that's the way he has governed. And I think if he had been forced politically towards the center here, he might have a better shot in 2024 of making some gains and keeping the presidency. But he may be misled into bitter business as usual and not making any of those changes, like trying to get some U.S. energy production going that all voters would really appreciate at the ballot box in 2024.
If Republicans take the narrow House majority, there'll be a check on the things that happened in the first term. The progressive agenda is not going to move. But the narrowness of the Republican victory, if it even is one, basically has given Biden the license and the Democrats, I think, to come to the conclusion that the voters did not repudiate their agenda. And therefore, they're going to continue to press it at every opportunity. Number one, that's going to mean gridlock in Washington for the next 2 years, which may not be a bad thing. But it also means there's no sense of reflection or introspection on the part of the Democrats about their agenda.
Yeah. And by the way, I celebrate gridlock, especially after the past 2 years. Bring on the gridlock. I would be thrilled by that outcome. It's remarkable because Democrats, I think along the lines of what Kyle was saying, they need to be looking ahead to 2024 as well, too. And maybe they're continuing to bank that Donald Trump won't go away and he'll still be there front and center, and that this is going to help him in 2024 too, because he's such a polarizing figure. That was one of the remarkable things, is that Joe Biden stood up there and said, oh, I am doing these things that I promised to do, unity and everything, and suggested that that was in somehow behind what happened. When in reality, he was out there warning everybody right and left that democracy was on the ballot and pointing to Donald Trump, talking about mega, MAGA, ultra Republicans. It was the opposite of the unity message, but it was the strategy that Democrats used to keep Donald Trump in everybody's minds and help them, as it turns out, successfully in this election. They're going to probably bank on doing that again. But at some point, Donald Trump is not going to be on the ballot. And the refusal of Democrats to take a hard look at their progressive agenda, what it's actually meant for the economy, for inflation, for people's households, for the cost of energy, and reflect that many Americans were not coming out to vote for that agenda as much as voting against candidates that they were still uneasy with on the Republican side. At some point, that's going to go away. And I think the Democratic failure to look at how disconnected this agenda is from so many average voters, at some point, is going to catch up with them.
All right. We will see how this plays out. As a last note today, we've got a letter from a reader. I want to respond to that. It's from Clayton. It says, hi, Potomac Watch team. With Georgia headed for a runoff that could determine the Senate majority, you think Herschel Walker could ask Governor DeSantis to campaign with him? Definitely seems like this would be a good strategic move. Better than asking former President Trump to campaign with him, given what we've seen in these midterms. However, given that Walker is a Trump-anointed candidate and Trump and DeSantis are likely on a political collision course, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you think the run-up to the runoff will play out. Well, Clayton, number one, Walker's already invited DeSantis to come in, and DeSantis' people are saying he will. There's no question about that. As for Donald Trump, I think that's a little more awkward decision. It would be hard for him to keep Trump out if Trump wants to campaign. On the other hand, Trump is toxic in some of these Atlanta suburbs in particular. So it's a dicey question. I suspect if you're going to bring him in, you bring him in early. You don't bring him in for the closing argument. And that may be the decision that they make. Kyle, any other thought?
I agree. And Walker may feel like he needs to do just enough to keep Trump from trying to burn it all down, which is what happened in Georgia's runoffs in 2021. President Trump was upset about the election. He wanted state officials, including in Georgia, to do more about overturning his loss to Joe Biden, and they refused to. And so President Trump went to Georgia in the run-up to those runoff elections, but he was only talking about himself, only talking about voter fraud, and the result was that Republicans lost both of those. And so Walker's team may feel like they need to do enough to placate Trump and prevent that from happening again. But I agree with you, Paul. Get Ron DeSantis there, get Glenn Youngkin, governor of Virginia, down there, and build your campaign around that kind of stuff.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Clayton, for the letter. Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for listening. We will be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.